Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Drobo Broadcast Network. My name is Mario Blandini at Drobo, and today we're talking about cloud infrastructure. And not cloud storage, the way we have a couple times in the past on our program, but more cloud computing infrastructure and how smaller IT environments can optimize their cost with tiered storage as a part of the architecture. And joining us today to talk about the topic is John Arrasjid, who is Principal Architect and a VMware Certified Design Expert with VMware. How are you doing today, John?
Doing very good. Thank you for having me on.
Awesome. Well, can you leverage the power of cloud computing using your existing IT infrastructure? If you're virtualizing, odds are you can, because virtualization is that first enabling building block. So it's really great to have you on, John, to talk about that, because VMware is recognized as the global leader in virtualization and cloud infrastructure. The purpose of today's discussion for the folks that are participating, in smaller IT organizations, it's often just one or two folks, and they likely have some investment in virtualization already, whether it's VMware or something else, and they want to take advantage of some of the same benefits that come from newer architectures that larger organizations might be using. They just may not know how to go about doing that. So, John, maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about your experience and what you do on a day-to-day basis.
So I'll start with the second one first. So one of the core responsibilities that I have is working on leading the team that's developing our reference architecture toolkit, which actually supports a number of different use cases. And in that, we're covering everything from enterprise and cloud providers all the way down to SMB solutions. And one of the things that we are finding is that more companies are going down the path of cloud, not necessarily because any one and only one reason. There's usually many different reasons, and the typical top drivers are business alignment with the IT organizations. How do you help the business be more successful in time to market? How do you actually provide better efficiencies on supporting the requirements that they have for resources and new workloads that are going out there? And we're seeing more SMBs also doing an adoption of having a mix. Usually, in many cases, it's a private cloud mixed with a service provider. So think of it as a hybrid cloud, where the idea is all their material is behind a firewall, but they have these dedicated links between the two different locations. And in many cases, the SMBs are looking for both performance but also cost benefits in the solutions that they choose for their cloud deployments.
Yeah, and you didn't go directly into working for a technology company. You've worked in IT a lot over the past 3 decades. And didn't mean to make you feel like you were a highly experienced person saying 3 decades, but you're a young guy at heart, and certainly someone who has a lot of expertise in this area. So thanks again for joining us on today's broadcast. Let's talk about cloud computing for SMBs. Face it, cloud is a very hyped technology right now, and people looking at Drobo would normally think of storage in the cloud or cloud storage, but cloud computing is something bigger than that. And maybe you can give us an idea of what, from a VMware perspective, and at least from your perspective, working on these architectures, what does cloud computing mean? Because there's tons of different definitions. It'd be good to get your take on what it means for a smaller organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we are finding is that it's not just the technology. In many cases, we've done pilots where we've actually been able to stand up a vCloud environment in half a day, a short number of time to actually put it together for a proof of concept to kind of give some demonstration purposes. But typically, going to the cloud is something that I would liken to what happened back around 2001 to 2003 when we started seeing this turning point of people going from physical as their primary basis for running operating systems and applications to virtual. And now we're at that next changing point where we see it's going from virtual and moving into this cloud space. So you still have virtualization as the foundation. It's the underlying layer that gives you the application mobility, the isolation capabilities, and the way to treat operating systems and applications and even groups of those in a multi-tiered app as an object. And by doing that within the cloud, we can provide some other mechanisms to support everything from internal compliance guidelines to external government or regulatory compliance guidelines. Being able to provide business units to do their own self-management, but still follow those regulatory compliance guidelines and also the change control processes that a company might have. The biggest change that I do see is that organizations need to realize it's not just about new technology. It's about really understanding the business requirements and the operational aspects. And that's one of the things that we are working on adding with the new VCAT 3 and some of the other projects that we have, is providing more guidance on the operational aspects. There's the planning, but then once you start running this, how do you prevent server sprawl in the cloud, like you sometimes have seen in physical and virtual areas, if you don't have the right control mechanisms in place or the right processes to support not just the business, but also the budgetary considerations.
You're right, and for smaller organizations, management efficiencies, I think, is what they're looking for the most, but it's also got to work on the business side. It's got to lower the cost of delivery and lower the cost of infrastructure in order to make a lot of sense. So virtualization, I would agree with you 100%, John, is the essential enabling technology, so you have that mobility and the abstraction, so you have the freedom to move things around. From a definition perspective, there's a lot of hype around private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud, and for a lot of folks, they have a hard time understanding what that is. How do you define those in the most simple terms? Hybrid, I think, is easy. It's a mixture of both, private being something you have 100% in-house. Maybe talk a little bit about public and private as it relates to smaller organizations.
Sure. So in smaller organizations, SMB in particular, I see hybrid as being a big win. Basically, there are a number of different definitions out there, but basically I look at hybrid as connecting two or more clouds. And the idea is it's not connecting a private cloud to a public cloud per se, but it might be connecting two private clouds where one of them is at a public cloud service provider. And the definitions sometimes become a little bit challenging, but if you think of it that way, it'll be easier to understand. And what I see with the SMB market is developing proof of concepts within their environment, maybe starting out with some dev test or certain smaller environments first to get familiar with not only the technology, but the procedures, the operational aspects that need to run that environment. And then what happens is those SMBs will tend to either grow the environment in-house to a certain size, and at some point they may make that next step, which is where they talk to a cloud service provider and say, okay, we want to do a hybrid cloud. And in those cases, it could be over the internet where you have a dedicated SSL connection or something along those lines. You could also use MPLS. In some cases, since the U.S. still has a lot of dark fiber, I'm not sure if this is common in a lot of other countries outside the U.S., but we do have a lot of dark fiber that hasn't been used, and so now some private companies are deciding to use that as their mechanism to connect to the service provider and give them a physical separation, not just the SSL or other type of software-based separation.
You know, I liked how you said that a public cloud doesn't have to be public per se in the sense that it might be hosted by a service provider, but still be private to your organization and dedicated to your organization. So in that sense, just it's an off-site private cloud. Heck, so many ways to describe how the relationships work. Let's talk about the basic architecture then about it. It's a combination of physical servers that are running applications in your private cloud. Most people in a small organization would have at least their stuff internally. Two or more SAN storage devices to tier the right type of capacity at the right price point for the right performance based on your requirements, and a combination of software technologies from VMware. Now, I've really enjoyed looking as the VCAT has evolved over the years to include a lot more elements in it to help people understand how to build that architecture. Maybe you could talk a little bit about VCAT and how it applies to SMBs, because you're already on version 3.0, which is out there, right?
Yes, that is correct. So the release that's currently available is on /go/VCAT on the VMware site, and in there we have version 2.01. We are currently working on version 3.0, and just like in the past where we're working with different vendors like Drobo, we're trying to identify what are the decision points to help an enterprise, an SMB, or a service provider do a cloud deployment or work with a cloud provider. One of the things that we are trying to provide in here is information that can be used for multiple use cases. In some cases, we have items that are specifically targeted to maybe an SMB or a service provider or a large enterprise. But if you look at the large enterprises, when you talk about remote office or test dev environments, in many cases they have a similar set of requirements, from what I've seen, to an SMB, where you have a limited number of admins, or you have people that are a mix of a developer and an admin, or some other skill set and an admin. And in those cases, a cloud deployment could actually make it much easier to meet the business requirements with that lower staff size. The idea is, how can you work more efficiently? How can you actually provide the mechanisms to provide a self-healing environment? So if a problem does come up, you could use some of our notification tools, our monitoring tools, as well as some third-party tools to use other pieces of software, such as Orchestrator or some of the other workflow engines, to actually drive workflows to create, I guess I'll say, a more stable environment if there are some areas that are at risk. So, for example, you may have a need during a certain period of time to increase the amount of computing equipment that you have in your environment. And in some cases, that can be done by adding additional hardware, dynamically, working with a service provider, or it might even be an opposite type of solution where you may shut certain systems down that may not be as critical for maybe an e-commerce deployment. There's a number of different ways, and I'm probably giving you a very general term there, but it's important to understand there are many ways that you can do an implementation and many ways that it can provide a benefit to your environment. And what we try to provide in VCAT are the design considerations, the characteristics, as well as the justifications and the impact to other areas of the design for those decisions. So if you are an SMB, you can look at our reference architecture implementation examples that show if you had this particular set of physical hardware and this set of software, how you might actually do a deployment. And in many cases, the physical items that we include can easily be swapped in and out with other different vendors. And I know you mentioned SAN there, and we look at storage that is available outside of the actual server. So that actually does include SAN, NAS, as well as other technologies that are becoming more prevalent nowadays, things like having 10G access for getting high performance. So that's pretty much the gist of it on what you can get out of that. Understanding from an architect, an operator, and a consumer perspective the items that you need to understand when you do design, when you do implementation, or if you're discussing solutions with a service provider.
It's great. I like a lot of the examples that are in the VCAT architecture stuff. In terms of tiering storage, it's a part of how you think about an architecture, because not only do people have different application processing requirements that they can move around, but there's also a benefit to putting storage in the right place at the right performance. You probably get a lot of this stuff, which is why you agreed to come on today's webcast with us to talk about storage and Drobo. If you had multiple storage devices at different price points, that's one approach. And I think that's probably something that larger organizations can do because they have enough storage to justify buying multiple devices, and they can buy them at different cost points. Can you give us a little bit of information about one of the new technologies in VMware 5, specifically storage profiles? Because it's something, it's built into vSphere 5, and it allows you to define bronze, silver, gold, different tiers of storage, and helps work into all that orchestration that you talked about in VCAT.
Yeah, we had a lot of requests over the last, I'll say about a year and a half or so, on how to provide storage tiering for the applications. And what we did in the current version of VCAT is talk about how you can use different provider virtual data centers, or PVDCs, to actually support different tiers of storage for maybe, as an example, a front-end web server, an application server, and a database server. And what we found is that we needed to do some additional work, and this is the basis for what was done in the newer technologies with vSphere 5, to provide profiles that could actually be adapted and used at the cloud layer. So that's going to be the next step, and one of the things that we do see right now is that many of the customers that we're working with that are in the SMB space need to look at not just what VMware can do, but what the storage vendors can do. And being able to provide, I'll give you an example here, giving the ability to provide tiering on the back end means that they don't have to worry as much about the configuration. All they need to be aware of is that if the data is used on a regular basis, it can be migrated to maybe the fastest storage or certain other characteristics that support that storage. And the material that's not used regularly, maybe something that hasn't been touched in 3 months, why should that sit on the fastest storage? So in the example that you're showing here on Approach 2, SSD, SAS, and SATA, basically I would look at maybe the things that require the fastest response time might fit into the SSD space, but if the data hasn't been touched in a few months, why keep it on the most expensive storage? And so that basically many of our customers are looking at both the VMware technologies and the vendor technologies and working with them together. So you'll see more of this discussion and more information around design considerations for this in the VCAT 3.0, which will be out around the VMworld timeframe. And just like in the past, this is where we'll look at vendors like yourself with what Drobo is doing to get some input on how we can provide guidance, stay vendor agnostic in our material, and then basically link over to our VMware Solutions Exchange where you and other vendors will provide specific details on how you integrate with the VCAP solutions.
I absolutely agree, John, that it's an and function versus an or function, not one way or the other. The tiering within a system is something that's not unique to Drobo. There are several vendors out there promoting solutions that allow you to have tiering that's automated in the sense that you can have data moved and migrated automatically as the needs of the applications change. So that's certainly a technology you're going to want to look into, and it goes into the decision-making process of the building blocks you use as a part of Approach 1. You can choose different storage tiers, and in those tiers have sub-LUN tiering, as some of the technology people would call it, an automated tiering that helps provide the benefit in 2 dimensions there. So you can get there. You don't have to always buy just one type of storage. In fact, cloud computing doesn't work as an architecture if the assumption is you only use one type of high-end storage as a part of the architecture. You need to tier things out in order to make the overall architecture work. So in terms of talking about price points and performance elsewhere, you touched on remote offices, John, them requiring a subset of applications or smaller applications. So their architecture looks different than the primary data center does in a larger organization. And for SMBs, they do need high availability, but maybe they can't afford enterprise tier 1 stuff. So that's why doing things inside the box are great. Or, as you mentioned, leveraging a service provider that can give them that off-site capability and potentially higher levels of service for some of their workloads if they're done from the service provider's infrastructure, not done from the private cloud, so to speak, inside the SMB's premises.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that we do see as heterogeneous storage solutions is more of the norm from the customers I've talked to. They may have vendor preferences for their primary vendor, but when you start looking at remote offices or DR type of storage solutions, you want to look at something that will provide what you need for availability, and then you need to decide, does the cost justify the performance level? So in many cases, customers say availability is more important than the actual performance, and in those cases, that's where they might have maybe lower tiering storage at an alternate location. Now, when we look at the SMBs, the remote office, and test dev, performance is still important. And in those cases, the SMBs may be looking for a lower cost solution, but have the flexibility to have dynamic use of storage devices, the ability to provide different types of storage tiering, and also provide some mechanism of reliability or availability. Infrastructure resiliency is very important, and storage is one of the foundational areas that the customers look to on making sure they get the right solution and finding a choice that will work for their use case.
Well, I think your own lab at VMware, where you're doing a lot of this solution development's a good example there. It's not necessarily a tier 1 production environment, yet you're doing a lot of the same things that you would be doing in that sort of environment. So you likely leverage multiple tiers of storage from multiple vendors, even in your own labs, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we do have some Drobo equipment in. We have some EMC. We have a few other different types of storage, and even some non-commercial storage, just to try different things out so that when we get SMBs use cases, we can kind of get an idea on what types of storage they might be using to fit their price point, their performance, their SLAs, so that we have a better understanding when we develop our vCloud Architecture Toolkit and to give them the right guidance on there. Now, once again, we stay vendor agnostic in vCAT, but the idea is we want to be able to provide a mechanism so that the third-party vendors, we have an alignment with what they're trying to do without providing any special favoritism. I do find that in the environment that we've had, one of the things that we did like about utilizing Drobo was the ability to mix and match different storage types. And there aren't too many vendors right now that actually do that. So that's something that we did find of value for an SMB that might want to reuse some of their existing hardware in a heterogeneous type of storage solution.
Well, we're both from California, John, so we love to recycle and reuse as much as possible.
Yep.
And one of the favorite projects I have in helping smaller organizations is they'll take that half dozen or so physical servers that they used to have, they'll reclaim the hard drives from inside those systems and deploy them in a Drobo. Because we do offer that super easy mix and match storage capability in a Drobo, they're able to create and seed their SAN with the same hard drives they had before. And given that there was some disruption in the supply of hard drives last year due to flooding in Thailand, we saw a lot more of people doing that because those old hard drives that you thought weren't worth anything are worth a whole heck of a lot. So it's one of the things that we do like about Drobo as well. Great for test dev, remote office, but also for SMB. In terms of leveraging vCloud Director, there's a lot of concerns that folks might have, John, about the implementation. How arduous is that going to be? Because I think people are always worried about that first step in their journey to the cloud, so to speak, it being too tough. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how some things like fast provisioning and the services catalog help people in terms of making the implementation of migration easy.
Sure. I want people to really understand one key thing about this. It's the same type of change as I mentioned before when people were going from physical to virtual. There are concerns about security, implementation, speed of the delivery and efficiency and meeting SLAs. So when we're actually talking to customers and trying to address that, one of the things that we have learned is that providing additional material, white papers and things like that related to both the implementation and the security aspects, we are putting out there. So you can find those white papers on our website, and vCAT will be providing additional information in there, as you can probably already see in the current version. As we're going forward, we do look at the service catalog as a way to standardize on an approach for a software lifecycle for an application. You basically do your QA, you do your testing and all that stuff in one environment. You put it into the service catalog, and then you have the processes for supporting who is allowed to do deployments, maintenance, and all of that stuff. It's just a logical extension to what we've done in virtualization. In many cases, a lot of customers feel that, going to vCloud, should they or shouldn't they? The bottom line is cloud is the natural next step to virtualization. In many cases, we have customers who built out cloud environments already with virtualization. We think this is just the next step on providing the automation, the ability to provide workflows to support their business requirements and their IT requirements, the security mechanisms, tools like vShield and other different components within the environment to support the security and the compliance areas. So, yes, I think that if you look at rapid provisioning, if you look at the service catalog, you look at the different workflow engines like Orchestrator, these tools will actually help support an SMB in many different ways, including the ability to operate efficiently with a smaller staff. And I'm not talking about removing the people that you already have. I'm talking about allowing them to work smarter and be more efficient and be more aligned with the business, which actually gives a much better working relationship between IT and the business. So instead of having potentially two silos, which I sometimes have seen over the last 20, 30 years, where there's kind of some friction, This actually helps lower the barrier, and instead of having the friction, you actually see smoother operations, you see better success rates, and you have better support of the IT organizations when they actually do this correctly. But once again, as I said before, the operational aspects will help. If you can do that first, that will actually help drive the use and the adoption of the solutions that vCloud Director and the other vCloud technologies provide.
Hey, great. So in terms of comparing approaches, we're taking a slightly different step here into the concept of replication. There's different ways to do it. You can do it in software, you can do it as an appliance, or from the storage itself. And we talked at a high level about architectures for availability. Most of the time when it comes to disaster tolerance, you need to have data exist in more than one location. And cloud certainly makes that a whole lot easier. Never before could a small business actually replicate data off-site because they only had one office. You have a very long list of service providers, John, that are part of your vCloud partner program that offer their cloud services that tie directly in to the way the cloud architecture works. They probably offer a combination of these things. A lot of them do let you replicate your disk to their disk, what we found is disk-based replication really has historically been costly because you have to buy that larger scale storage device up front that does the disk-based replication, where software replication can be a better fit for SMBs. I also think it's a better fit for cloud because it's easier for those cloud vendors to go ahead and do that. And as we go to the next slide, Site Recovery Manager is a technology that does make this a lot easier for people to do because the replication's coming from within vSphere itself, and so orchestration can be made a lot easier. Can you give us any information about how Site Recovery Manager ties into the vCloud architecture and how you can do that with some of your vCloud partners?
Sure. So one of the things that people do need to be aware of is that there are still some additional things that VMware is working on to provide tight integration between vSphere, vCloud, and Site Recovery Manager. So right now, if people are interested in using Site Recovery Manager, there is a white paper and a tech note that was put out by Duncan Epping, who's also a VCDX, on how to use SRM in that environment. And that is something that we're using as the solution for today. Going forward, the idea is to have tighter integration and tighter coupling, basically have as much automation as possible to actually support a full cloud SRM solution. But what we've found with some customers and with some service providers is that, let's take away the vCloud side for a moment and look at vSphere. What they've done is using it for helping with data migration, setting up new data center locations. One of the customers that we have in California basically had multiple locations across the U.S., and what they did is, in the environment in the U.S., they set up two environments, and they use Site Recovery Manager to do that initial test and the replication and get it all synchronized. They ship the secondary site's equipment to that secondary site location, re-enabled Site Recovery Manager with the replication to actually get it resynced, and now they actually have the two locations, one as a backup for the other. Now, when we look at some of the new technologies that we're adding in where vSphere provides host-based replication, the idea for that is to provide something that is vendor agnostic, to provide something that will allow the SMBs to get started. This is not designed necessarily to be an end-all, cure-all for every possible use case, but we do see it as a very big win for an SMB space or smaller environments where you might have a remote office where maybe the cost of the replication technology might be out of bounds for what an SMB might have as far as their budget goes. So this provides another mechanism to support yet another solution for that type of replication.
Well, John, more than just the affordability of it, to me, because it's tied into the management console that they spend all their time in. At the end of the day, I'll admit, I think Drobo storage is cool and lots of storage technologies are cool, but the average IT person is not spending the lion's share of their time there. They're spending it in vCenter. They're spending it in orchestration because that's where they provide value and make sure they tune and optimize their applications. Because they can manage it there, it makes it much more realistic than having to learn several different technologies that exist on the endpoints. Moreover, because it can replicate between dissimilar storage arrays, and you talked about it being open and vendor neutral, that's probably the biggest thing that enables it to be used, because you can take exactly what you have already and just about anything you might have in the future and use replication between those two storage devices. That's really important from a flexibility standpoint, and that abstraction is part of the same architecture that enabled this cloud thing in the first place, because it wasn't until you could get the applications abstracted from the physical machines that you could have a lot more of this freedom. To me, I see this as a really huge development from VMware, making it easier for customers to abstract now where the storage actually lives and enable some of those projects like a migration. Hey, face it, those are hard projects, and people have a hard time doing those with the freedom that virtualization gives you, and in this case, the storage replication. It really helps in a project like that. So in terms of putting it all together, vCloud Director, it is a product that's available as a license from VMware for managing up to 25 virtual machines at a fairly affordable cost. Now, this requires the vSphere Enterprise license, and you do need the vCenter standard as a part of doing that. From a Drobo perspective, you could use this as Tier 1 if you were in a very small organization, depending on your performance requirements. John, thanks a lot for your advice and your insight as to where the performance lies there, because it's not a really black and white or polarized discussion around what's the right thing for the application. Applications vary, and you would choose your storage accordingly, but most certainly the concept of having different storage devices that are easy to use and tiers at the right price capacity point are going to help you in terms of putting all of that together. And with technologies like storage profiles, makes the provisioning easy on the right tier. Technologies like a Site Recovery Manager and vSphere Replication make mobility amongst those tiers also very easy. So as we go to wrap it up, John, a couple questions. A lot of folks, the first step's always the hardest. I'm personally, it's now we're in the month of April. I still haven't implemented most of my New Year's resolutions around fitness and health. I'll have to get to those maybe after tax day here. But that first step, how many VMs do I need to have before I should start looking at a solution like vCloud? Because it might be easy enough if I have a small number. When do you see people normally starting to look at vCloud? Where do they need to get? Do they start from the beginning, or do they reach a certain size before they start thinking about it?
Yeah, so that's an important question, because we do get this specifically tied to VMs on a regular basis. And what we've actually found is it's not the number of VMs, it's the operational readiness. Because if you aren't ready with the defined procedures, you may not be able to take advantage of what cloud has to offer, in particular vCloud Director and some of the other technologies. So to give you a rough idea, if a customer has a dev test environment, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 1,000 VMs. They could take advantage of the vCloud, because the IT group can now give that group that is running that dev test environment to be able to do checkouts, or I should say from the service catalog, deployments of 1 or more machines for doing their type of their testing or their evaluation. So if it's a very small environment, it's very easy to actually go ahead and start using this, and you may not need all of that operational readiness. As you start getting to a bigger company where you've got thousands or tens of thousands of VMs or vApps, it's very important that you have the operational guidelines in place, the workflows defined first before you go into the cloud. Otherwise, you might have some challenges in the adoption. One of the things that I'd like to say is we introduce complexity in the back-end infrastructure to really simplify the consumption and the operations going forward. And I think that's kind of the driver. So if I were to pick an exact number, it's very hard to say that, but if I said it was an SMB, a dozen or more VMs could take advantage of the vCloud. You just have to decide, is the price point right? Are you ready? Do you have enough VMs to fit that right price point? And in many cases, the capabilities and the efficiencies that are provided may justify going forward even with a smaller number of VMs. But most of the cloud deployments that we start working with is for companies that have already done virtualization. They may have anywhere from 100 or more VMs deployed, and what they'll do is they'll pick a subset of those to start their pilot program, learn how everything operates, learn what might need to be modified in the procedures, and then they start growing from there. So I wouldn't say it's an all or nothing. I would say there's a starting point which may be a smaller number of VMs or a small number of applications, and then it grows from there as people learn how to actually use the technology and carve up the resources correctly. It's very similar to what we went through almost 8 years ago with virtualization.
All right, history tends to repeat itself when it is a successful solution, and I totally agree with you. Thanks a lot, John, for being on the program today with us, because while most people might not think that a small organization would do something like vCloud, certainly a medium-sized business or that company who has a dozen VMs, as you mentioned, but is likely to continue to evolve and use virtualization as the platform to drive their private cloud and hybrid cloud solution, it does make sense for them to start thinking about that, which is why Drobo has done some testing and work with the VCAT architecture, and we have a how-to guide, which is posted at drobo.com/vcloud, which you can get information on. For folks who want to follow John as a sage of wisdom and as a great author of many books, you can find a lot of his books as well, and as you'll see from his Twitter handle, he was the very first VMware certified design expert. So I personally follow you as getting up-to-date information on when new stuff's coming out around cloud, and also the cool examples of how people are using it, because no one ever wants to be the alone. They want to know other people are doing that. And for folks who want to get more information, you can look on the VMware's Solution Exchange, which is that they call it a store. It's a vendor store, but it's a place where all of the folks that are participating with VMware are putting these types of solutions so that you can get that information and use it in your own design and your own architectures. And it's a very vendor-neutral thing, but we appreciate as a vendor out there in the ecosystem how VMware has provided that place to put this information, as well as the support from other organizations to work on these architectures to help folks out. So we definitely thank you for listening, and if you want to get more information on VCAT, I give you a very long URL here. A short URL would be vmware.com/go/VCAT. We'll get you the same place, right, John?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Any other last comments before we wrap up? I know that VMworld's going to be big this year, and no going to Vegas. We're just driving up the 101 here to San Francisco. Any prognostication you want to make in terms of what's going on between now and then?
I think you're going to see a lot, not just from VMware, but from vendors around cloud. I think one of the things that I'm planning on doing is we have 4 or 5 related VCAT sessions that are tied to helping architects, operators, and consumers to understand how to use VCAT with their deployments and how to actually consume that material. And if everything goes as planned, you'll probably see me up there with my carving guitar playing along with Elastic Sky on the Wednesday night. So no promises yet, but we're waiting to hear from that. I think we'll be playing one more time.
That's awesome, John. Hey, John, thanks again for joining us today on the program. Folks appreciated the expertise.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, and thank you for participating. Join us next time as we continue discussions around architectures for storage and cloud around small and medium business. Mario Blandini on behalf of Drobo, thanking you for participating. Check us out next time on the Drobo Broadcast Network.